So after 1 year, I looked at myself in the mirror one day and I saw myself in my rat hat and my slide rule and everything. I said, is this what I wanted to be? And I concluded no. So I didn't even know what an engineer was. I never had been in an industrial plant, in an industrial environment. I was raised in the retailing business. I knew they did more than drive trains, but that's about all I knew about engineers. So I did very well academically, but no girls, no parties, getting up and going to school with a factory whistle, etc. I decided this is not the place for me. So I quit school and went to New York and worked for Merrill Lynch on the New York Stock Exchange. I was a runner. That's before they started. Everything was electronic. You had an order, he handed it to somebody, i.e. me. I ran over to the other guy, gave him the order, he gave me the confirmation, and I ran back. I did that for 8 or 9 months, damn near starved to death in New York, and came back and enrolled at the University of Georgia, and in business, and had the time of my life. Georgia at that time was consistently ranked the first or second party school in the United States, and we worked very hard to defend that reputation and maintained it the whole time I was there. We used to have the saying, every time some publications came out, we always said the same thing, thank God for Mississippi, because they were at the bottom and we were next. But it really was not much of a school. But I had a wonderful experience, learned a lot about life, and then decided I got to go get a job. In the meantime, I'd met my wife over there, Ada Lee. She was a school teacher, so we got married like you did back then as soon as you got out of undergraduate school, and went off to conquer the world. After a false start in retailing, I ended up working for a company called Westvaco in Covington, Virginia, which is now West Rock here in Atlanta. They made bleach board. And I was a commercial analyst, but you had to work in the operation side to learn something about what the company did for a living. And I absolutely fell in love with it. I fell in love with average working people who carried a lunch pail and got a check and were union members, and an industry that was doing something good. And I decided that's what I wanted to do with my life. I wanted to work in the pulp and paper industry. So I applied to graduate school because I knew I didn't have much of an education. Applied 2 places, got in both. One was Harvard and one was Maine. Went to the University of Maine because they gave me a scholarship. We didn't have a dime and I couldn't afford to pay Harvard. So we went to Maine and I enrolled in their pulp and paper technology program, which is a lightweight chemical engineering program for the pulp and paper industry, and I think it still exists. And got a master's degree and then stayed on and got a master's in chemical engineering. I'm probably the only person you'll ever meet who's undergraduate degrees in business and their graduate degrees in chemical engineering. Was gonna stay on and get a PhD, and then something strange happened. My wife got pregnant, and she was the money winner of the family because she was teaching school, and so I had to go to work, which was a horrifying experience at age 26, but I concluded I did. So we sat down and talked about what was really important, and I said to Ailey, what's really important to me is I want to make some money. I don't want to be poor, and I don't want to raise our children poor. I've tried being poor, and it's not as much fun. I've never been rich, but I want to try something different. So we're going to go to work for a big international company, and I'm going to go wherever they want me. So we went to Plymouth, North Carolina. Most of you don't know where Plymouth is. It's on the outer part of the eastern part of North Carolina that nobody admits exists, way out there with pine trees and no people. We employed 5,000 people in a town of 4,000 people. And so it really was in the boondocks. In the meantime, my son Alston and my daughter Elizabeth were both born there. We were there 8 years. And two things were going on in the world that didn't mean much to anybody unless you're in the pulp and paper business. Georgia Pacific discovered how to make plywood out of southern pine logs, which gave big pine trees in the South value. The second thing, Weyerhaeuser discovered how to make copy paper or writing paper out of southern pine fibers and oak fibers. And suddenly, southern timberlands were worth money. So the whole industry exploded. And they will remember, you may not, but when copy paper was the thing and people were making copies of everything and the industry was booming and people were building new mills everywhere. And I developed a reputation as a startup guy. So we went around the country, moved umpteen jillion times to various places. I used to ask my son and daughter where they were from, and they were stumped for an answer because they knew where they live now and they knew where they were born, but they've been so many other places, it kind of got lost. Places like Pine Bluff, Arkansas, we lived. And when we moved there, it was voted the worst place to live in the United States. And my son always said it was overrated, but, but it was terrible. Then we moved to Tacoma, Washington. Really loved it, and suddenly they were going to move me again to Mississippi to build a new mill and be region vice president down there. And the first time in my life I made a decision for my family and not me. And I concluded I didn't want my kids educated in the public school system of Mississippi. So I took a job with the Weyerhaeuser Company and was held captive in Ohio for almost 10 years, in Dayton, Ohio, which had a wonderful education system, but was a miserable place to live. And I worked for a company called the Mead Corporation. They had a lot of ideas, but not much money, and so we had joint ventures all over the world, and I ran those, and so I was gone constantly. But it was a wonderful growth experience, and then they decided that they wanted to develop, they were working heavily in two technologies, Lexus, which still exists, which is the legal recovery system, and Nexus, and they had this view that they were going to publish online news and charge people for it. I didn't know a hell of a lot about the internet or things like that, but I knew people weren't going to pay for news more than their morning paper. So we had a big argument, and I quit. And and I went home, and of course, Alston's a junior at Vanderbilt. My daughter's a freshman at Ohio State, and Daddy's unemployed. So, and in Dayton, Ohio. So I started looking for a job, and I called Marshall Hahn, who was running Georgia Pacific here. I told Marshall, I said, I just quit Mead, I need a job. And he said, well, I've got one. I don't know what it pays or what its title is, but I've got a job for you. I said, that sounds like exactly what I'm looking for. When can I show up? And he said, no, wait a minute, you got to interview. So I came down and I took the job, and the rest, I guess, is a dream come true. We moved back to Georgia. I joined the company in '88, was made president in '93, made chairman in '93. It made president in '91, chairman in '93, and ran it until the Koch brothers bought it, which was in late 2007, which is a story in and of itself. The Koch's called. I got a call from an investment banker one night. I was sitting at home, and we were trying to sell our pulp business, and they said, Koch wants to buy your pulp business. I said, what the hell does Coca-Cola know about the pulp business? And they said, wrong Koch. And I said, have these people got any money? He said, yeah, they got money. So we sold the business to the Koch brothers. And then I was sitting on a Sunday night again, 3 years later, and the phone rang, and Charles Koch, he said, Pete, I've got a heck of a problem. And I said, what's that, Charles? He said, I've got $10 billion of cash, and I don't know what to do with it, and I'd like to come talk to you. I said, well, if you come talk to me, I'm going to solve your problem. And we sold the business to Koch, and it still exists under the Georgia Pacific name, and will probably forever, because Koch's not exactly a consumer-friendly name. And Georgia Pacific is, because people built their houses out of plywood, et cetera. And we became the largest tissue manufacturer in the world. And when paper was going down, tissue was going up, and I used to give all these Wall Street presentations, and they'd talk to me about the market, and I said, well, the only thing I know is 99.5% of the people in the United States that are surveyed say they use toilet paper. And I don't intend to survey the other 0.5% to see what in the world they're doing. So my product's going to have demand for quite a while. And lo and behold, it is. It still grows. And so we built a big franchise, and I left. I stayed on for a while as chairman, but as you can imagine, working for two multi-billionaires, and they ask your opinion, they really don't want it. So after a while, I said, you guys really don't want me around here, let me go. So I left and went in the private equity business, and I was terrible at it. It was mid-market private equity, and it's a tough business because the businesses are small, the numbers are usually wrong, you have no idea which way they're wrong, nothing is audited, so you run into incompetence everywhere. So after doing that a while, I have a good friend, Tom Bell, who was CEO of Cousins Properties at the time. We went out for drinks one night. We usually went once a week and solved the problems of the world. And we were talking about Grady. Italy and I were running the capital campaign at Grady at Emory for the medical school, and we'd been to Grady that day. And I told Tom, I've never seen anything like that in my life. I mean, it was people writing on grease boards and people in the aisles and all that. And I said, I don't know anything about hospitals, but I know this sucker's in trouble. And he said, it's worse than you think. They're not going to be able to make payroll. They're out of money. And so we got another drink, and we said, well, somebody needs to do something about that. And we talked some more, and then we got another drink, and we said, well, we need to go fix it. And so that's one of those great American stories, and all of them start the same thing. Two guys went into a bar. So two guys went into a bar and emerged committed to fix Grady Hospital, and lo and behold, we were able to do it. We were able to do it based on contacts. I went to see Jimmy Williams, who was chairman of the Woodruff Foundation, and I said, Jimmy'd been on my board and I was on his board. And I said, I need your help, Jimmy. And he said, what do you need to do? And I said, I need you to give me some money. Then I need you to go to the other foundations in town with me and tell them that you think our plan for saving Grady is credible, Woodruff is going to put some money in it, and you think they should too. And he said, how much money do you need, Pete? And I said, well, I need at least $200 million to be credible. And he said, well, why don't we give you the whole $200 million? And I said, well, that would be a hell of a lot simpler than my plan. And they did, and we were off and running, and many of you know and have read that Grady's a howling success. So what did I learn during all that period? What did I learn about business, about myself? I learned several things. Number one, there's no such thing as a free lunch. You need to sit down and decide what you want to accomplish in life and what price you're willing to pay for it. And I was fortunate I did that very early. I wanted to be economically successful so I could live a life so I didn't have to worry about money. And I was willing to pay a price for that. The people that I used to interview at Georgia Pacific they'd come in and they'd say, I want your job, Mr. Correll, someday. That's what I want to do. I said, well, there's no reason you can't have it if you're willing to pay the price. So, yeah, but I don't want to leave Atlanta. I said, well, your odds just dropped to damn near zero, but keep going. And I like to live in this neighborhood, and I want to do this. I said, that's not the price. The price in big corporations is they come first. The second thing I learned, which is really, and I've given a version of this speech to a number of business schools, is business graduates don't understand cash. And nothing matters but cash. I've met so many business students who are just phenomenal at reading a balance sheet and an income statement. And I keep saying, those really don't matter. You cannot go to the grocery store and buy anything with earnings per share. They want money. So if you want to be successful in any business, understand the cash flow characteristics of the business. Understand where the money goes, where it comes from, where it goes, and what levers there are you can pull to change that. When we went to look at Grady, it was hemorrhaging cash. And we sat down, and I just sat down one night and went through, well, look at this. And we did some things like we went to the employees and said, we cannot afford a defined contribution pension plan, a defined benefit. You're going to have to switch to a defined contribution. Well, that is heresy for public workers. That strikes all over the country. And I said, well, there's two options. You could close and not have a job, or you could convert to a 401k and have a job, but we can't make it. The employees voted 100% to change. So I think it says understanding cash and being able to talk to people about cash is important. It's important in all of life. Running out of money is a tough thing. I mean, I've had some in my private equity world. To see a company just flat run out of money, it's a really tough situation when the lenders won't lend anymore. If there is no more, there's nobody with money but the employees and the stockholders aren't going to give any more. It's tough. So I would encourage you, spend a lot of time looking at cash flow statements. And when you're being employed and you're looking to go out and you're interviewing, ask to see their cash flow statement. They'll have to dig to find it usually, but anyway. The third thing I learned, which is really important, and I've coined a funny phrase that's been quoted a lot, is I could accomplish more in 12 hours than most people could in 8. And it simply says I could outwork you. If I worked 60 hours a week and you worked 40, the odds were high I could get more done than you did. And in the business world where results are all that counts, and the only thing you've got is time, the more of your time you give, the more highly likely you are to be noticed. And the fourth thing, is some people have an innate understanding of business, of money, of people, etc. And others don't, and it doesn't necessarily matter how educated you are. Some people just get it. And other people struggle with it. They look for a set of rules or something. And what it is it's an idea of creating wealth. And to create wealth, you have to start with something that's not worth much and convince somebody to pay more for it. And now maybe you manufacture it like you do in the paper business. You start with a tree and end up with a piece of toilet paper. Or it's an intellectual business. You start with an idea and you end up with a product or a concept that people will pay money for. But you got to create wealth. And the last thing, and I could talk a little longer, but the last thing is try to never forget that the shareholders own the company. So many managers become convinced that they own the joint and it's their company. And the shareholder is just some amorphous person that puts up the money. Well, whether it's a private equity business or it's a public company, the shareholder ultimately provides the capital, so the shareholder owns the place and the shareholder calls the shots. And the shareholder generally doesn't even understand what the company does for a living. All they understand is what kind of return are they getting on their investment. So when you attempt to philosophize with shareholders, generally they're bright young analysts and they say, that's very interesting. What's your compound return on shareholder equity for the past X years or Y years or whatever? And that's why some companies shouldn't be public, like the forest products industry, and you may know some others that are so cyclical that Wall Street punishes them so bad on the down cycle that you can't think long term. And if you're Charles and David Koch, David's dead now, but each one's worth $50 billion, they can think long term. They have They can think through cycles. And I think you're seeing a reemergence in America, not of hedge fund owned, not of consulting firm owned, but of private owned companies that are being run for the long term. And there are certain industries that as you look through it and you go through school, you'll recognize really can't deal in a short-term shareholder world. So my story is pretty simple. I had some simple premises. I knew how to work hard. I was a good old Southern boy and never lost my accent. And so when I went to the North, they laughed at me. When I came home South, people said, sounds right to me. And it's interesting if you're willing to pay the price, even in today's more regulated world that I grew up in, there's a wonderful opportunity out there for anybody who wants to take a chance. And maybe I ought to just pause and answer any questions you've got, and then we could talk a few minutes more.
Mr. Correll, thank you so much for sharing your story. So yes, we'll open it up to the audience for questions, and we just ask that you raise your hand and wait for the microphone. And yeah, thank you.
Okay, thanks for coming out today. Actually, I have several questions, but I'll just ask one. And when you were when you were running Georgia Pacific, how did you evaluate the most senior executives that worked for you? Was it primarily based on financial metrics, given your perspective regarding the importance of generating returns for shareholders, or did you take a balanced approach of some sort in evaluating the talent that you had working for you?
I was a believer, and still am, in relative performance. So if I had a guy running our container board business, which is packaging and corrugated boxes, etc., then there were a lot of companies that did nothing but that. So we could create a peer set and say, while the tissue business may be booming and your business could be in the crapper, all I'm concerned about is how are you performing versus other people running a business in a crappy cycle. And building products, of course, is a classic. There's no such thing as an average year. It's like this, and you just kind of try to figure out where you are. But it's spewing cash. So I believe in relative performance. So yes, metric, yes, performance, but all metric. The hardest part I had was with staff people. I didn't know how to evaluate, and I read a lot, talked to a lot of people, and how do you evaluate a controller? If you had a good audit, he did his job. If you didn't, he didn't. But I mean, there had to be more to it than that. But the operating people and the management people were easy. You just did it on a comparative basis. We had tissue businesses in France and in Finland, and in fact, we had the biggest business in Spain, et cetera. And there were all kind of Spanish companies you could have compared them to. So it was relatively easy. It just took a lot of work to pull together the set.
What was it based on the financial performance relative to those competitors and other measures?
Yeah, there was a certain amount of, well, you can't be a total ass. And a certain amount of, you can't treat people like that, because I spend all my time defending what you said or who you said it to or how you treated it. And remember, this is almost before the political correctness wave. So I'm on the beginning end of that. But there were a lot of personal things. And then you would have some things I want you to go do. You're not very good at this. I want you to go concentrate on that. So there was a lot of those kind of things. We spent a lot of time on a performance evaluation. I'm not sure we got it right, but I know we tried. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, Mr. Correll. Thanks for coming. I'm Kendall, and my question is, it's very clear that throughout your life you become comfortable asking for help when you need it, and it's actually been to your benefit the majority of the time. And so my question is, when did you kind of have that realization that asking for your help was actually best for you and or the company you were running?
Well, I had another rule. Bad news does not get better with time. Don't ever forget that. So the sooner we found out something was bad, the sooner we could do something. I had a network because I had come up through the industry and come up through a variety of companies of friends and prior associates that when I was facing something I just didn't understand, I had people I could call and say, help me through this. Occasionally I got into things that were almost ununderstandable by mortal man, like the asbestos suits. We had a little business that Georgia Pacific bought in 1957 called Best Wall Gypsum. Their total sales of that, they made the paste that goes on, separates wallboard. You know, when they put got a seam, you got to put the paste over it. Well, that had asbestos in it because it would fall off the wall if it didn't. It had to have those long fibers. And so people sanded it down and did the wall. So total sales of the business was $1 million. By the time we sold Georgia Pacific, we had 200,000 lawsuits of people that would swear they sat in a room when their daddy redid the room and she remembered the exact writing on the Best Wall Gypsum wall paste, and she was 7 years old. I found that somewhat amazing and somewhat hard to believe. So once I contacted attorneys like David Boyce, who defended Gore, and got those people on my side and said, I need help. I'm in a world I don't know anything about. And so I never viewed it as a weakness to ask for help, and I try to encourage other people not to, because all that really matters is the results.
Thank you for sharing.
So from your time in college, what was the biggest thing that you learned about people or business?
I learned a couple of things. One of it is that most people want to do the right job and want to do the right thing. So if you find a group of people not performing, the first question you got to ask yourself is, do they understand what is expected of them? And the second set is, do they have the tools to do what is expected of them? I ran across very few people who were incompetent and meant to be. Most people who were incompetent were trying their damnedest to do the right thing. They just either didn't know how, didn't have the tools, or truly a few just couldn't do it. I mean, they just didn't get the right equipment when the game started. But I think if you enter life saying, everybody that works with me is trying their very best, and if they're not performing, what have I done wrong that doesn't give them a chance to perform? And after you're satisfied with that question, and I've fired as many people as most executives will in their life, then you're comfortable saying, I've done all I can do, you didn't do it, you need to go find another job. But that's the most important thing I've learned, that people, even organized Frenchmen, want to do the right thing. If you can just sit them down and talk to them and have them understand and then provide them the tools. I know that sounds Pollyanna, but it's true.
Hi, thank you for coming. So was there part of running and sort of like driving the culture for the company that really stood out to you as particularly good and helpful, or like something you struggled with within the company?
Well, when I took over Georgia Pacific, it was a red check shirt male-dominated, testosterone-filled company. It competed cutting down great big trees and everything. And I decided we had to have some brands that we had to create some additional value. So we entered the consumer products business, which meant A, bring in a lot of women, and B, be much more inclusive as a company. So I sat our team down and I said, I have some great news for you. We're going to win the Catalyst Award, which is given every year to the company that provides the greatest work environment opportunity for women and minorities. And all those white guys looked at me like, have you lost your damn mind? And so we set on a committed journey to do it. We did it. We built a consumer products company. We ended up with a woman running our tissue business, which was our biggest business. But we had a culture to change with no empirical data to say it needed to be changed. Because big building products companies still exist today. They don't sell for a very high multiple, but Louisiana Pacific still exists, et cetera, et cetera. So that was quite a challenge, but it's what the story we were just talking about. If you sit down and explain to people why we sell for 3 times multiple of cash flow, and Procter & Gamble sells for 15 times multiple of cash flow, think what that would do for our shareholders and for you as an investor. If we would never get to 15, but if we could get up 10 and triple our stock price simply by changing the multiple, not changing the earnings, which comes from changing the perception, which comes from eliminating the cyclicality, which comes from lowering the beta, which all comes from a culture change. And we found that people really value the Georgia-Pacific name, probably because their parents built their houses out of Georgia-Pacific plywood, and they remember seeing it, and it's still standing, so they think it must be a pretty good company because the wall didn't fall down.
You clearly created a lot of shareholder value when you were head of Georgia Pacific, but I'm also interested in you talking about the value you created in the community through your philanthropy and through what you did at Grady and other places.
Well, I was very lucky. I went to work for a company called Georgia Pacific that believed in involving itself in its local communities. Because we had 400 facilities scattered around the world. Generally, they were in poor communities because people don't live where trees grow. And if you cut down trees for a living, you got to be near the trees. And so we had to take an active role in the school system, in the hospital, in anything else if we wanted to be able to attract employees to those places. So when GP moved to Atlanta, they brought that culture with them. So when I joined GP, Marshall Hahn, who was my boss, made it clear that he wanted to be involved in the community, and he expected me to do some things too. And I probably overdid it. Clearly, Grady was an insane thing to do. Nobody in their right mind, except an old unemployed guy, would have done that, because it exposed the worst of Atlanta. I mean, if people ask you what the number one problem in Atlanta is and you don't answer race, you didn't understand the question. And so it exposed the raw nerves of both the white and the black community in Atlanta. And it was pretty painful. I mean, I got death threats. I've gotten them my whole life from Georgia Pacific because people don't like people who cut down trees. But Adalie got death threats. It's the first time in our life that my wife ever was threatened. So there were people who were really upset about what was going on because they didn't understand. They thought we were going to buy it, convert it to condominiums and shut it down and all this other horse manure. But once we fought through it really, well, I will say this, of all the things I've accomplished in my life, I'm proudest of Grady Hospital. I ride by that place and I think, that's a first-class hospital. When Adalie had a horse wreck, she was riding her horse down at our oil plantation and a horse ran away from her and threw her, and she broke her collarbone, her ribs, her pelvis, and she's 77 years old. As I said, honey, I think what you learned is if you're 77, don't get off the horse till he stops. But anyway, she got off in full gallop, and all I could think of is if I can get her to Grady, I'm down in Albany, if I can get her to Grady, that's the best trauma hospital in the South, and they will fix her. And they did, and we did. So if you have a trauma, or you get burned, or you have, for God's sake, if you have a stroke, go to Grady. If any of your parents have a stroke, do not pause, do not pass go, get them to Grady.
Hi, thank you so much for your time. So it seems through your career, you've clearly mastered the art of persuasion. You've raised a very impressive amount of money for these various causes, Grady, Ebenezer Baptist Church. How do you do it?
I don't know. I think, I'm sincere. I think everybody knows that when I say something, I meant it. And if I'm upset about something, there must be a reason. And if I care about something, I care about it, and I care about it to the extent that I'll put sweat equity in. And I think that's what people are looking for. It's people that will provide the sweat. Giving money is easy. And Adelaide and I have been blessed, and we get to do it. But that doesn't take any time. But committing to do something takes time. And that's what, when Jimmy Williams and I had that famous conversation, I said, well, Jimmy, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take over the hospital. I'm going to fire the CEO. I'm going to run the place till I can find one. I'm going to fire most of the top management. We're going to replace the whole board with a board that is elects its own successors. There will be no politicians. And Jimmy said, thank God you only asked for $200 million. If I didn't think you stood a chance of doing that. If you'd asked for 500, I'd probably told you that's fine too, because I knew it wasn't going to happen. So I think it's some combination of just an innocent Southern boy, and he's willing to put his heart and soul in it. But you're right, I've been blessed. I've raised a lot of money. We've raised over $500 million for Grady. And the counties just gave us 100. That's in that money.
I have a question. So you've moved around a lot in your life. So we've seen so far. So how have you kind of like embraced that change and like learned to grow from that? And what have you really learned about life with all the moving around?
Well, I love the peanuts thing, you know. Change is easy. You go first. Retiring is the hardest thing you do. I mean, really, y'all got a long time before you worry about that, but that's a miserable experience. Because one day you're needed every second, and the next day, you know, you get up in the morning and say, nobody even cares if I get up. And then you'll have a day where somebody cares and you get pumped up. I have always been a relatively adaptable person as long as you didn't violate some of my core beliefs. I was born and raised a Southern Democrat, and I was about as democratic as a Democrat could be. My dad was a big Democratic supporter in South Georgia, and Herman Talmadge, and he went up to John Kennedy, and then all of a sudden the Democrats started saying things I didn't believe, and Ronald Reagan came along, and now I'm a Republican. So I'm relatively changeable as long as you don't violate what I believe.
In that case, I have a question as well. I'm over here. Sorry. Just with all of your moving around, as what Perry said, but how did you manage work-life balance with your family, staying connected, but still saying yes? Okay.
I didn't manage it at all. Adelaide raised my children. I showed up occasionally, and Adelaide always told them I was great, so they thought I was great. They were nice to me. But I paid a price. I didn't go to ball games. I didn't go to soccer games. There is a price to pay. I worked all the time. And but I was lucky. I was married to a woman who was totally committed to the family and totally committed to holding us together. And together we pulled it off. I have gotten to know my grandchildren so much better now that I've retired than I ever knew my children at their age. And so people who say they truly balance it, I wonder if they're lying, and if they're not, I really admire them because I couldn't pull it off.
Hi. I have kind of a similar question, talking about like being willing to pay the price for like a job opportunity or something. Are there occasions where you think it's okay to not be willing to pay the price?
100%.
And how would you recommend like evaluating?
And I am so
that?
envious of people that are a school teacher, and that's what they wanted to be. They're a principal, they're a life insurance salesman, they're captain of their coach of the ball team, etc. They have decided exactly what's important to them, and they're happy with their choice. And that's the only message I preach. Please try to be happy with your choice. Don't be Pete Correll and then lament that you didn't have a family life. You decided early on to do that. Or don't be the insurance salesman who's captain of your son's, coach of your son's football team and lament that you don't make as much money as other people do. That's a choice you made. The happy people I meet in life are the people who've made that decision and are captive with it. And the miserable people I meet are people who didn't ever make the decision and just let life make it for them, and then they're resentful. So please, I'm not preaching the corporate life. There are days I'd have swapped with a school teacher at Glenn Academy in Brunswick, Georgia, any day.
Thank you so much for coming out, Pete. I guess my question is, a lot of people who are, in the eyes of society, successful, all have their golden rules about this is required to be successful, or this is my take on it. What would you say, in your opinion, is the biggest myth about success that you've, come to that conclusion?
Well, first of all, the biggest myth is it's a pyramid, and it gets mighty narrow at the top. And you got to have hands up to get up that pyramid. And people who don't admit that at various times in their career, somebody reached down and pulled them up beyond where they should be and gave them a chance aren't being honest with you. So I think the biggest myth is I did it myself. I had a team that wasn't even on my team. They just dropped in and out and said, well, old Pete needs some help. Let me see if I can do. So I think that's the biggest myth. The other one is that people say, I paid a hell of a price. I loved it. I absolutely loved it. I loved strolling out and jumping on my Challenger and having somebody wait up. I mean, it's a good life. Granted, it's a hard life, but it's a good life. But seriously, I think as you go through life, be conscious of who's helping you up. I mean, not necessarily picking you up when you've fallen down, but just people who say, Pete's not quite ready for that job, but I think we ought to give him a chance. And those kind of people change your life. And most of the time, you don't even know who they are. I mean, I'm blessed. I know who 3 or 4 of mine were. Like when Marshall Hahn hired me. I mean, he had a company with 40,000 people. Why would he hire a guy from the Mead Corporation that he hardly knew? But he did.
All right, thank you for coming again. So even though you're retired but still active, serving on certain, boards, I'm curious about the transition from a, very busy corporate life to the retirement stage.
It's hard. The main thing that's hard is the power you lose. People ask me, when you're retired, what what was the biggest thing you missed? It was the power. Riding to work one day on the interstate, the connector, hear that Ebenezer Church is going to shut down their project. The Olympics are coming. Ebenezer Church is going to be closed, etc. In 10 minutes, I raised $1 million from making calls to other CEOs and saying, GP will kick in 100, would you kick in 100? And talked to Roberto Guazzetta, and he said, I'll call this person, I'll call that. And before I got to work, we'd raised $1 million and restarted contribution. If I call now, they say, Mr. Correll, what company were you with? So it is, if you're in a position at the top of the pyramid, you can accomplish a whole lot, and you miss that. You get frustrated when you say, we'll do something. When I said we'll do something, I had 55 or 60,000 employees to back me up. Now I turn around and look and they leave me. So it's an entirely different world, and I miss it. Let me just make sure of one thing. The Georgia Tech I remember is not the Georgia Tech you're going to. Please remember that. You're going to hear a lot of tech jokes, especially from people my age. By the way, I'm an alumni. Wayne Clough made me an official alumni. When he was here, I had been here 1 year, and I finished one whole year. And I have my alumni pin, which I couldn't find, but I started to wear. If I could have found it, I would. So you're part of a fabulous institution. I'm not so sure I was, but I'm sure I didn't belong. Georgia people love to tell tech jokes. So.
All right. Well, I think that concludes our session today. Thank you so much again, Mr.
Thank
Coe.
you.
Another round of applause.
Y'all have a good afternoon. Oh, great. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
I really enjoyed it.